guilty to lying to the FBI about his conversation with a Russian ambassador and became a key figure in special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Russia's election interference in 2016 and ties to the Trump campaign. Today, White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany echoed Trump's attack on the FBI's probe.
Federal investigators appeared to paint a target on the back of General Michael Flynn.
Attorney General William Barr is an outspoken critic of the Mueller probe. Critics are questioning whether the Justice Department is still nonpartisan. The state of Georgia is vowing a thorough investigation into the deadly shooting of Ahmaud Arbery. The young black man was killed in February, but it was only this week that his white alleged killers, father and son, were arrested and charged with murder following a nationwide outcry for action. People have taken to the streets in Indianapolis this week following 2 police shootings in under 8 hours. From member station WFYI, Jill Sheridan has details.
Protests were peaceful as community members marched downtown chanting "No justice, no peace." Large groups have also been gathering near the place where 21-year-old Drajon Reed was shot and killed by a police officer after a chase that Reed streamed live on Facebook. Hours later in nearby, 19-year-old Mikhail Rose was shot after he fired on officers in what police are calling an ambush. Reverend David Green with Concerned Clergy of Indianapolis says the community is concerned because the investigative process has failed in the past.
That's why you see so many people upset, frustrated, the rallies, because it's going to be the same process.
Groups point to a lack of body camera footage, little diversity in leadership, and failed bias training that was heard in the Facebook video when an officer made an inappropriate comment. More protests are expected this weekend. For NPR News, I'm Jill Sheridan.
New York Governor Andrew Cuomo says the state is making significant progress in the fight against coronavirus, but the fight is far from over. NPR's Windsor Johnson reports the rate of hospitalizations continues to fall and the number of new infections remains flat.
Governor Cuomo says for the first time, the state is ahead of the outbreak. Speaking at his daily briefing, he said people's actions will ultimately shape the course of the pandemic.
We are reducing the rate of infection by our actions, wearing the masks, the close downs, the precautions. We turn that curve, and we are going to determine what that rate of infection is going forward.
The governor also says the state is investigating how COVID-19 impacts kids after a 5-year-old died in New York City from what appeared to be a rare syndrome linked to the coronavirus that causes life-threatening inflammation. Cuomo says more than 70 children in the state have reportedly been sickened with the illness. Windsor Johnston, NPR News.
You're listening to NPR News. President Trump says Katie Miller, the spokeswoman for Vice President Mike Pence, has tested positive for coronavirus. Miller is married to the president's senior aide, Stephen Miller. Trump says Mrs. Miller had been testing negative until today. He says he has not come into contact with her, but Trump says Miller has spent some time with the vice president, whose office, as Pence, has subsequently been tested and found to be negative. The 75th anniversary of victory in Europe is being observed in a quiet way, with COVID-19 restrictions preventing public commemorations. Terry Schultz reports from Brussels, where NATO is thanking those who made its creation possible.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg marked Victory in Europe Day by honoring the millions of service members who died in World War II and those who try today to prevent more wars.
NATO was forged from the ruins of war, built on the unbreakable bond between Europe and North America. We remember all those who sacrificed for our freedom, and we thank our armed forces who continue to keep us safe in today's unpredictable world.
NATO was founded 5 years after the end of World War II. In the famous words of its first Secretary General, to keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. West Germany became a member in 1955, joined by East Germany after the two countries unified in 1990. For NPR News, I'm Terry Schultz in Brussels.
U.S. stocks are trading higher, with the Dow up 1.5% or 380 points at 24,255. S&P 500 and NASDAQ up nearly 1.5%. This is NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Ooma, a cloud-based phone service for small businesses with an automated virtual receptionist and mobility features to run businesses from anywhere. More at OOMA.com. And Americans for the Arts.
It's 3:06. You're listening to WAMU 88.5. I'm Jerry Mitchell. Today is Friday, and it is the Friday before Mother's Day. So happy Mother's Day to all of the mothers and mothers-to-be. Coming up this afternoon on All Things Considered, the meat packing plant has slowed down due to the coronavirus outbreaks. Meat packers warn that it could lead to meat shortages and stores limiting purchases. Listen from 4 to 8.
From NPR and WBUR, I'm Tanya Mosley.
I'm Jeremy Hobson. It's Here and Now, and NPR is confirming today that an aide to Vice President Mike Pence has tested positive for COVID-19. This is the third known case at the White House, and we will continue to follow that story.
We're also getting the latest picture yet today of how the economy is weathering this pandemic, and it's looking pretty bleak. More than 20 million Americans lost their jobs in April, according to the Labor Department. 14.7% of Americans are now out of work. Here's economist Austin Goolsbee reacting on CNBC this morning.
That level is lower than at the height of the Great Depression. But in terms of the speed at which it happens, it's worse than the Great Depression. This has got to be the most heartbreaking day in the history of the job market.
And yet the stock market has been higher today. For more, let's bring in Mike Regan, senior editor at Bloomberg News. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Jeremy.
And I guess one of the big questions here is, with this just devastating report, is how many of these job losses are temporary furloughs versus how many are permanent? Do we know?
Yeah, and it's a great point. The vast majority are temporary, or at least some of those temporary layoffs turn into something more permanent. So that is the big question.
And we remember back in March, most of the job losses were in industries like the restaurant industry and tourism. What are we seeing in this report about which industries were affected by the
leisure and hospitality group, again, was among the hardest hit. They lost about 7.7 million jobs, mainly in bars and restaurants, that type of thing. But it's a very widespread weakness throughout basically almost every industry in this report. For example, the arts and entertainment and recreation industry lost 1.3 million. And even professional and business services, what you consider sort of good white-collar jobs, lost like 2.1 million jobs. So the weakness is spread out pretty much across almost the entire economy.
We're also getting a snapshot today of the racial and gender breakdown of these job losses. What can you tell us about that?
It does seem like women and minorities are getting hit a little bit harder in this situation. For example, the unemployment rate for adult men was 13%. For adult women, it was 15.5%. And the rate was 17% for African Americans and almost 19% for Hispanics. So it definitely hitting those groups harder than the sort of adult male population.
And it was about 14.2% for white Americans when it comes to the unemployment rate. Meanwhile, Mike, the stock market, with this terrible news, the worst jobs report in most people's lifetimes, the stock market's up. Why?
Well, there's just been so much money put into the system by the Federal Reserve to sort of counteract the economic damage and the government stimulus efforts. Think about those checks that people are receiving in the mail. That said, there is a lot of debate about whether, the market is being a little too optimistic about all this. A lot of people are skeptical of this rebound in the market that we've seen. It's kind of common in bear markets for there to be these really sharp rebounds that prove to be only temporary. So we'll have to just see what happens.
Now, you use that word again, temporary, and let me go back to sort of where we started with this, which is how permanent this situation is going to be. One of the White House's economic advisors says that he thinks that the unemployment rate is going to go up into the 20s in terms of percentage. And J.P. Morgan is saying that it might take 10 years to fully recover. What are you hearing about that?
Yeah, I think in order to recoup all of these lost jobs, the discussion is definitely in years rather than months. So much depends on how things proceed when the economy does sort of reopen in earnest. Not only the risk of another wave of the virus flaring up and sort of causing some of these lockdown measures to be reimposed, but also just there's a lot of question about consumer behavior. Will it be changed for, say, the next year or longer because of this? Will people sort of be afraid to go back to restaurants and movie theaters and stadiums and that sort of thing? So that is a really big question mark that economists just really can't quantify at the moment, unfortunately.
That is Mike Regan, senior editor at Bloomberg News. Mike, thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Doctors in the U.S. and abroad are reporting clusters of children hospitalized with a rare and serious inflammatory syndrome that shares features with Kawasaki disease and also toxic shock syndrome. Infectious disease specialists say it's too early to say whether the illness is linked to COVID-19, but there is speculation the two are related. And that's because some of the kids who exhibit these symptoms also tested positive for the coronavirus, and others tested positive for antibodies that show they were previously infected. Dr. Sunil Sood is an infectious disease specialist and chair of pediatrics at Northwell Health's Southside Hospital in Bay Shore, New York, and at Cohen Children's Hospital. And Dr. Sood joins us via Skype. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, Doctor, New York City has 15 reported cases and 64 potential cases throughout your state. You've treated more than half a dozen patients with this rare condition at Cohen Children's Hospital. Tell us what you're seeing.
So last week, almost exactly 1 month after the epidemic began to peak in New York and Long Island, about 24 children have come into our hospitals with severe symptoms that initially suggested something called Kawasaki disease. Those symptoms included high fever, bright red rashes, red eyes, and some children had swollen hands and feet. And some children were sick enough that they had to be cared for in the intensive care unit.
You have said, though, that you're not sure if this is Kawasaki. Tell us why.
So Kawasaki disease occurs in about 1 in 1,000 children in the U.S. under the age of 5 years. The majority of these children were older than 5 years old, and also they did not have all the classic symptoms that accompanied Kawasaki disease. And also the percentage of children who actually needed intensive care because of depressed functioning of the heart was much higher than we see in Kawasaki disease. So that made me think that this is actually a wider spectrum of disease occurring after the initial coronavirus infection.
I see. We've been hearing that France's health minister says pediatricians and critical care medics in his country are investigating links between this disease and COVID-19. What are your thoughts? Do you anticipate that there's going to be a connection?
So I think we know almost for sure there is a connection for two reasons. One, children have been quarantined at home since the middle of March, since schools were closed. And we are really not seeing anything else going around. So the usual other spring viral infections are opening up.